Hi everyone, I've just hit my microphone. Welcome to State of Play, the Buddy Cop football podcast starring Adam Clery and Miguel Delaney. Before we start, I've got to tell you something, because we didn't have the name settled when we started last time. So when that went out, it wasn't sort of nailed down. A friend of mine texted me straight away and said, given that you call out bad operators in the Premier League, but also speculate about what might be about to come, you should have called it Digs and Theories with Miggs and Clery.
That's quite good, actually.
I don't hate it, you know. I could see the T-shirt. But anyway, this is State of Play, and we're here because Liverpool have won the Premier League. 4 games to go, no real title challenge. People on the internet are saying it's boring and it was lucky, but we don't think that, do we?
No. I do have to say, as we were approaching this weekend, and I was kind of like writing all the stuff about, because I had to do stuff in the cup final, the cup semis this week, and my thinking was almost to say something like, as regards to kind of Liverpool's victory, something has finally happened in the Premier League again. But again, I think the first thing to say is like people, like I did something last week, well, on exactly this, on the cup semi-final, and how there's like a sense of life to it. It really mattered to at least 3 of the clubs, and it does matter to City now as well. But I kind of headline after a drab season, or in a drab season, or something, and the response I got, and actually not even an X, on Blue Sky.
Wow!
People, I know,
the same one.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I got people. A lot of Liverpool fans were triggered by the words. It's been a drab season. I don't think one relates to the other anyway. Like it's not comment on Liverpool's title that the season has been dull. It's not like there's no fault here. I don't think that also means it's been a bad season in terms of quality. Like sometimes it's just the way it falls.
Yes.
And I suppose the classic example, like to make the comparison, like 05-06, that Chelsea team are considered one of the great sides in English history. That was a season I would say that was even more dull than this one. So the two aren't related. And really, I mean, it just speaks to Liverpool's quality. I think that they have just ensured.
You're going a very long way around apologising to the Liverpool fans on Blue Sky here.
I know. Look, I don't feel I should have to make an apology.
Right, okay, so that kind of non-apology we get. Career in politics awaits. But the lucky thing, that's kind of where we wanted to jump in, because a lot of people have said that, like, the fact it was a drab season and that there was no title race and the relegation places were more or less decided in October, it sort of felt like, was sort of down to the fact that not through any great success or skill of Liverpool's own, but simply that Man City weren't around because Rodri took up a big injury, Haaland's missed quite a lot of the season. You look at Arsenal as well, they've just lost Gabriel, but Saka's been out, Ødegaard's been out, they've had injury problems at the same time. So it wasn't so much that Liverpool were good, it's just that nobody else was around to challenge them. But that's kind of what we wanted to talk about, because that's rubbish, isn't it? Like, so this was the plan. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, and the biggest point to make there, like, I think to touch on your question, like, or to kind of point to your question, like, when people talk about injuries and absence like that, it is always put in the terms of this is just pure luck. This is actually one exact case where it's absolutely not. And like I wrote the piece about this for when they won the title, and I think that sums it up. Basically, by the 1st of March, when Liverpool had pretty much won the league, I think we all accepted by the end of February it was done. Arsenal had that result against West Ham. But at that point, the 2 players with the most minutes in the Premier League, usually these are positions always filled by goalkeepers.
Yep.
There's 8 of the top 10 are usually goalkeepers. This season, 1 and 2 were Van Dijk and Salah.
That's nuts. I mean, that's like, I know that doesn't sound when you put it into words. As like, because I mentioned that in the video. They're now still 1 and 2 of outfield players.
Yeah.
There's 4 goalkeepers ahead of them, but they're still like right at the very top. When you put that into words, it doesn't really sound like that big a deal. Like, oh, Salah and Van Dijk played the most amount of minutes, but like that's extraordinary. Like 2 players past 30, both entering into a part where you're expecting to start seeing the physical decline. Like Salah last season, that's what everybody was saying why his goals were down, because it was his lowest goals in 7 years.
And that was in the context of his contract as well.
Exactly. He's like, oh, well, it's because he's slowing down. He'd be going to Saudi Arabia or something. Like, you know, he's not there at the top level of the Premier League anymore. And not just him, but Van Dijk, who a couple of years ago had the kind of injury that does shorten your career. They've played virtually every single minute in the Premier League this season. And not only that, at arguably the highest levels they've ever done it in terms of individual performance.
I'd say certainly Salah. Van Dijk, you can make the argument in 2019 or whatever, but yes,
it's certainly in the conversation. You know what I mean? It's in the conversation.
Yeah.
It's not like it feels like Konate is carrying him to an extent. It still feels like...
You see, we're talking about kind of one of the best centre-halves of all time, really. But exactly, I mean, and like Liverpool, just before they brought in Klopp, really, but Klopp almost an extension of that. They were the first, I suppose, to really and it was down to the ownership as well and the baseball background to kind of really kind of hone in this Moneyball element of football. And this is really from
great film, by the way.
Excellent film, yes. But from speaking to people at other clubs, especially those who work in kind of conditioning departments, speaking to some people at Liverpool, like the view is almost this is taking that Moneyball concept to its next, because obviously it's not just about recruitment, it's also about having your points on the pitch, and that is essentially what Liverpool have done in a season where injury crises have been a theme. In fact, arguably they've been one of the biggest factors in how the table has finished as it has, but that's also because Liverpool were able to adapt to it and adapt to a new calendar where there's Champions League games in January for the first time, better than any club. And again, that is not luck. That was part of a plan. And it was a very specific plan, of course, related to the succession after the Jurgen Klopp. And before we get into any of that, actually, this is worth addressing itself. Before we talk about like the science and the kind of the actual technical aspects, there's actually a massive emotional challenge there for the club and for Slot to come in after this, like,
all succession managers in the Premier League have been largely quite disastrous.
Yeah.
I don't think any of them have even... There's not really any arguments that many of them have maintained the momentum without going through sort of a resetting period. I can't recall one who's come in after such an emotionally charged, as you say, like resignation, and then not only carried it on, but really kicked them on. And immediately.
And I think that the big
without any money.
Exactly. Right. People would say in the Premier League that Liverpool still have one of the highest wage bills in football. Fair enough. But you're right about they brought in Chiesa, who we didn't really even use that much. But there's another element to that, the kind of the emotional part and the psychology, because obviously one of the reasons Klopp is considered one of the greatest managers of all time is because of that immense charismatic force of personality, and that essentially meant that they were an extremely manager-driven club, more so actually than most clubs are in the modern game. Now, but there is still a trend there, and I think this is where Liverpool's season is so interesting as regards potentially the future of football and the way the game is developing.
The future of football?
Yeah, I genuinely think so. I think this era could be, well, at least for a time, the final stage of maybe this manager as complete patriarch. So once Klopp left, and I don't want to get into a situation where it appears like we're criticising Klopp. As I said, I've said he's
the video I've just done, there was several parts where I was like, I just want to clarify, it's not criticism of Jurgen Klopp, merely an assessment of his working style.
Yeah, exactly. And look, and he has a very distinctive way of coaching, of playing, that made him one of the best coaches of all time. I would also caveat all this with saying, I don't think this Liverpool are as good as the Liverpool team that got 97 points in 2019 or the one that won it the next year. And
well, objectively, mathematically, they've not got the points haul of Liverpool teams that have failed to win the league.
Yeah, and they were Champions League winners. Yeah. But like so much of what Klopp is, and one of the reasons they were able to go to those levels is because that force of personality, how that actually marries with his tactical approach, the energy his teams put in. And there is a degree that's difficult to sustain. I think it's why Klopp had seasons where he went up and down, up and down. And it was, as I say, an extremely manager-driven club. And I don't think it's much of a secret to say that, obviously, I mean, you can look at the people who left Liverpool over a certain period. Because Klopp was so manager-driven in that sense, there were changes behind the scenes. And it is at least conspicuous that once Klopp was going, Michael Edwards, the kind of one of the most celebrated recruitment gurus in football now, he came back. And I wrote this in the piece that one of the things he wanted from the Liverpool he was coming back to was to be a performance-led club where the coach would sit in what is a much more, I say performance-led, it's a very specific term they use in football in that sense, but it essentially means science-led. And yes, Slot was very much picked for the job because he fit into that.
Well, weirdly, I think it wasn't long before they made the announcement, but after they'd announced Klopp was going. I'm not even sure if this is a conversation I'm allowed to openly say I was involved in, but somebody who had connections to Brentford, let's say, was about 90% convinced that Thomas Frank was going to go. Yeah. And when I was a little bit sort of taken aback by that because it wasn't really a name that I think he'd been mentioned, but certainly not near anywhere near the top of the conversation. He was like, you do not get how much this club wants to buy into the science, to the data. And Brentford right now are probably the best team in the Premier League at doing that. Like they've worked their way all the way up through the divisions using this approach, and they don't necessarily want someone to come in who's a brilliant manager with a massive personality and feels like they are the next Liverpool manager, but somebody who comes in and goes, yeah, do you know what? I'm a cog in this system. I understand it completely, and they were gonna buy into it, and they thought Frank was gonna get it off the basis. So when Slot ended up getting it, that kind of made a lot of sense to me. Because I was like, okay, that's kind of that exact sort of same approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that as well, I mean, I think this is a slight tangent, but like I know there's been a bit of debate over whether, say, Frank could rise to that level. I think when you speak to people in football, and to be honest, my own opinion would be, I think he definitely can, that he anchors his approach to what the club he has. So people talk about kind of the football he plays, which again, I would say is very reminiscent of some of what Liverpool have done. But I think that's again because of the players he had, and he is able to expand. And this is, I suppose, to bring it back around to Liverpool. I think where this is so interesting is like other people in football. One thing they would praise Brentford for is they're always slightly ahead of a trend. So as soon as something gets become widespread in football, Brentford almost go not quite the opposite direction, but do something different that gives them a competitive advantage. Brighton are obviously the same in recruitment, and Liverpool have been, in a way that can be difficult for the wealthier clubs to do because they're kind of, I mean, this is one, I don't want to say the disadvantages of money, but suddenly when you're able to go out and buy the best of everything, most things, it's kind of hard. It's harder to be nimble in your situation. Like it's easier to be innovative if you have to be innovative. But Liverpool have obviously led
necessity, the mother of invention,
exactly,
as they say.
Exactly, yeah. And Liverpool have been, I think, as nimble, or as innovatively nimble as a big club can be in that sense. And even so, like to bring it back around on a fitness thing, like I wrote this in the piece today about how once Edwards came in, the performance department, which essentially medical staff, fitness, conditioning, all that, they were empowered. Slot was collaborating with that system, and they use. I mean, I wouldn't be able to kind of talk about this in the kind of terms that really does it justice, but the best I can say is the most advanced AI-driven models to ensure basically not just that they're able to monitor patterns that show if a player is getting close to a situation that usually brings an injury, but it's real-time live monitoring of players, and hence that means, to bring it back to the Moneyball thing, they can always maximise their points on a pitch because they know exactly when a player will be at his peak.
Well, as I'm constantly saying to everybody I play five-a-side with, the best ability is availability.
Yeah.
But this is sort of like buying into that, like not just as a sort of like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to keep everybody fit? Or let's rest players more, because they plainly have not rested players. It's not that they're giving these like Van Dijk or Salah games off. It's not that they're rotating constantly. They've had a really unchanged 11 through, as you say, like all the way at the Carabao Cup final, this expanded Champions League format, pretty much the entire Premier League, even after it looked like they were going to win it. But sort of the mad thing about it to me is that people still look at that and go, like, oh, it's just luck. It's just luck. I mean, don't get me wrong. They have had injuries. Like, these injuries do happen. Like, I've got it there. Jota missed 15 games. Harvey Elliott, Joe Gomez. But literally, you're talking about 3 or 4 first-team players who missed 8, 9, or 10 games. And then they've got something like 11 or 12 members of the first-team squad who have not missed one single game.
Yeah, and again, coming back to that point, they were actually ahead of the curve there because, like in some situations, like say with Arsenal's, even City's to a degree, who obviously would have been their 2 main challengers, or we would consider 2 main challengers, they suffered these long-term injuries in different ways. And some of that was basically the tension of kind of having this new calendar imposed upon them. And I think that's natural there because clubs this is a new situation. Champions League games in January. And it isn't just about, of course, those 2 Champions League games in January. It's also because then suddenly the January schedule, which up until this season actually had a break for every club got a week off, then suddenly that's crammed with even more games. So like these January, I think they've had more matches than ever. That obviously it affects the rest of the season, how it's structured. And, similar actually happened in around the 2000 to 2002 period when the Champions League had been expanded. The World Cup was slightly earlier in 2002, and we saw a lot of exhausted players. It took football a while to kind of adapt to that. Whereas Liverpool now, they've almost adapted ahead of the fact. And that's one massive reason they've won a title. And another, I suppose, is Slot's own ability to it. And just coming back to the Klopp point as well, I think it's almost a little bit under discussed how he does play a totally different style of football to Slot.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry, to Klopp, yeah. Like,
I think the thing I touched on, because obviously you've written the article about this, I've done the video. Obviously, the third trifecta of modern content engagement is the audio format. So this one's for anybody currently on a run or stuck in traffic. The thing that Slot's done with this is not just that he's come in at this club and the club's managed to win this title and the club's managed to keep everybody fit. His role in that is he sort of takes the data, and if you watch Liverpool this season, they are so good at not having the tempo dictated to them. Like, they can be really aggressive and they can be in your face and they can play exactly like Klopp's sort of the great era of Liverpool did. They can win the ball back high up the pitch. They can press you there. But the crucial thing is, when they're not looking to do that, they don't then start chasing the game around. When they're not looking to be aggressive and high energy, they actually sit back and they sort of defend on their own terms. So going into games, knowing which players need, they've got 30 minutes of intense running in them, or they've got 45 minutes of like being able to do things. Being able to then manage the team around that information, to not push players into these red zones, to not force them to pick up injuries because they don't have the ball, or they are allowing the game to sort of be played in a manner they don't want it to be played. That's what's so good about what Slot's done. I mean, take away the transfer side of it's incredible. Just coming in, really getting a lot more out of the players you've already got. Like, look what he's done for Gravenberch. He's got Salah back up a couple of levels. Like, there's several players in that squad who looked like they either were one thing or were heading in one direction, and now they feel like Gakpo's another example. They feel like really, really important, excellent elite level players. But the main thing for me for Slot is this ability to just adapt the approach both between games and in games to make sure that they are taking advantage of that information as best they can.
They're kings of the second half in that sense, weren't they?
Well, exactly. You would imagine that comes from a lot of games where they've gone in and the data said, look, you can't be sprinting about for 90 minutes here. You can't be chasing the ball around. So those games where you do see them come alive in the second half, there's clearly a conscious effort there to be very energy conserving. So you sort of, write the first half off, but you certainly don't go out there and burn yourselves out in the first 45 when you know you're going to have to play a lot more tired later on. The whole thing, from the individual performances on the pitch, right the way up to sort of this plan they've devised the minute Klopp handed in his notice. I think it's one of the most impressive accomplishments I've ever seen in a single season.
And there's a bigger point to make on that exact thing. But just before, to pick up on what you said about the kind of performance level and the variety of different displays they've got. Like, there's two games actually that stood out for me in terms of Liverpool's season and why they are where they are, and also how they're evolving. One, I think, probably the most outstanding display.
Can I guess?
Go on, actually.
Is one the Real Madrid game?
No, actually.
Oh, right. I'll give up then.
But actually, it was funny because both of them were in that period.
Right.
So one of them was the closest I think they had to a Klopp display, which was the 2-0 win against Manchester City at home, where they the first 20 minutes.
They ate them alive.
That was 2-0, and it really could have been.
Yeah, it could have been anything.
Yeah. And that, just the sheer intensity of the way they went at it, the way Salah was opening up with all those angled passes. And then I thought, now they haven't won the Champions League, obviously, so. But still, it kind of contributes to kind of their campaign in that sense. But the closest to kind of maybe a pure Slot performance so far, or at least what we associate with it this season, was their win over Leverkusen, where it was a relatively...
Yeah, actually, that sort of flew under the radar, but in terms of like a professional, just sort of a complete performance, it was really good.
And it was also, because as you say, exactly what you're talking about, they controlled the game early on. It was actually one of those matches where there was always this thing with Liverpool in some games, and I think this maybe fed into some of the discussion around that. Oh, they had a lot of flat performances, but I don't think that's flatness. I think that's control.
Yeah,
and then they know how to up it and like to hit a team when they're vulnerable. And I thought the Leverkusen game was an exact example of that. And of course, there was all sorts of other kind of narrative strands there, given that was the guy Xabi Alonso,
who everybody else actually wanted. Yeah. I think that's a good sort of comparison to make, because that whole flat performance thing. There's been a lot of times when Liverpool have been on telly and they've been highly advertised by the broadcasters. Got to tune in, it's Liverpool. And the last time you saw them, they were really aggressive, and maybe it was a performance at the City game. Then they turn up and all of a sudden the tempo of the game is low and they're not playing really vertically. They're actually keeping the ball very well. And I think that's kind of led to this sort of weird narrative that sometimes they are a bit flat, when in reality, because we know the whole model is just like, we will go when we know it's good to go, and we'll hit teams when we know they're going to be weaker. It's just sort of like this balancing act of playing sort of very controlled possession football, but then being able to just switch it so quickly into playing really vertically, really sort of direct. And I don't get how people can fail to be impressed by that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are kind of satisfying historical echoes there. Like, everyone's obviously made the comparison between, Klopp and Shankly, but also, I mean, with the Bob Paisley thing. Paisley was the first. He essentially created Liverpool's European Cup era, because realising that they're going into a lot of continental games and they were kind of being out-thought in terms of passing. And I know it's quite simplistic, but it's a similar sort of thing. The way, basically, it's almost as if Slot has brought back that level of control, but for the modern era. And I mean, I think they were in terms of the Champions League. I do think Liverpool are one of the best sides in Europe. They were unlucky to get PSG when they did. I think they also got them when it was that one point of the season when Liverpool themselves were just a slightly lower ebb. It still just went to penalties though. And I think they will be thinking about not just retaining the title next season, but
well, not to sound like a Liverpool fan, but the European Cup is such an integral part of what defines eras of Liverpool teams. That Klopp was able to win it immediately sort of cemented that as being like a really important time for the club. I do think the club, as well as the fan base, will be looking at that going, well, if we can convert this into European success, then it's really, really worked. So I do think that'll be the priority for next season.
There's another thing with that as well, I suppose. And this did, when they went out of Europe, do you remember, like, Van Dijk was asked about, say, whether... And I think Van Dijk was right here. He's like, are you trying to say the league on its own isn't special? And
I remember that the post-match interview where they were like, "Oh, your season's collapsing a bit here. You've been beaten in the Carabao Cup finally. You're out of Europe." And he's like, "Right."
But I do think it's in the modern game, because we've been in this era where there's been such financial disparity that 12 clubs went off and tried to create a Super League, Liverpool being one of them. And because there is that disparity, we've obviously been in an era where suddenly 90 points is much more frequent. Doubles and trebles have become more frequent. Yep. We discussed this in the last pod, actually, how trebles are suddenly, having barely been seen up until 2008. We could potentially have the seventh in 17 years this year.
Barcelona are going for 3 trebles this season across their men's team, the women's team, and the academy team.
Yeah. And then we've got Paris Saint-Germain are aiming for that as well. So there is almost this sense that, that in that era, if you're going to win the league, you need to kind of almost embellish it with other feats, like either record points totals, unbeaten seasons, or another trophy. And maybe that's this slight sense that Liverpool weren't quite what they could have been. I think that's sometimes just the way it falls.
I think also to an extent, this is a whole other podcast, but I do think a lot of that comes down to this sort of like how disposable media is.
That's true, yeah.
Because you have to ask the question about, is this a disaster for your season?
Yeah.
Having gone out of the Champions League, because that's all there is to talk about tonight.
Yeah.
You know, if you go up to Virgil van Dijk and start talking about winning the Premier League at the end of the season, well, that's not what anybody's tuning in for tonight. So that's not the direction you can go with it. So I do think there's this sort of like the immediacy of having to respond to everything. In the sense of like, this is good or bad, discuss.
Yeah, exactly.
Even with footballers, I think there's sort of that to it. One thing I want to get onto, because we're going to try and keep this to a lean 30 minutes this time, right? Have you read or have you seen, or have you got any sort of first-hand info on the actual depth of the changes they immediately brought in when Slot came in? Because I've read about them, and they're extraordinary.
In terms of it was the pressing that was the biggest change, I was told.
No, I mean in terms of training.
Okay.
So sleep being the main one.
Yes.
Have you read all about that?
But this exactly fits into kind of their
I couldn't believe so they get a sleep analysis when they go into training every single day, where they have to tell one of the data team how they've slept, what time they went to bed. Then they get that sort of physically measured somewhere,
it's a level up from checking your Fitbit to see if
it's unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah. No, but I think this is where this team, whatever about their kind of legacy in football and all this sort of thing, and actually we should stress, and whatever about winning other trophies, for Liverpool, this is 20. Like that's
massive.
And also, as become so clear over the past few days, and was clear in the build-up really, it's one they get to celebrate in the way they didn't get to celebrate in 2020.
I was surprised actually during the season more wasn't being made of that as a narrative towards it. Like this is a chance. Yes, okay, they got the proverbial monkey off the back when they won it during COVID, because they didn't, this whole thing about them never winning a Premier League title. But that's. You don't want to diminish what an achievement that was by saying like, oh, years later, well, we didn't really count it anyway because we didn't get to do anything. But I can imagine if I'd been a Liverpool fan, that would have sat with me this whole time to somehow be getting these points totals, to have a team this good, a manager this good, and that be the only year we can get ourselves over the line. That would really sting with me. So I imagine the release of sort of just like emotion and relief and whatnot must have been enormous.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the true legacy of the season. It's 20, it's emotion, it's celebration. And we've seen that the last 2 days. But I think, speaking exactly to your point on the kind of the extent of the science, this is going to be a highly influential team in Premier League history. I think it's already going to influence how Arsenal do things even for next season. Because if you think about it, football, billion-dollar industry, all that, or multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's still the amount of waste it allows, because it's a human industry. And in the sense that, say, like I was speaking to an ex-player the other day, and they were talking about how and this I think is where issues like this are going to become so changeable. They were talking about how the medical staff would be advising that he would take a rest, and he would go into the manager's office and go, "I feel I can play. I'll take responsibility." But then on the other side of that, I mean, how many times have we heard over the last decade say a lot of managers, there has been a sense of wanting players to play through pain. And like, or kind of, they want warriors in their team. Whereas now I think this is going to be the start of a complete flip back in the other direction. I also think this was a conversation I was having with a chief executive in English football at another club. And they were talking about how they actually described Slot as the best manager in Europe right now. And actually, they said it to me in September. I did write that in The Independent, so there is evidence of that. Wow. But also that Slot and someone like Areola are going to represent the future of coaching in this sense, because they're not quite these... obviously, they're brilliant coaches, but they're coaches, as we said, that kind of are willing to work in a collaborative environment.
You wrote this in the article, which this is a line I took directly out of your article and put in the video, so thanks for that, by the way. They took advantage of his lack of ego to bring in this sort of structure. That, again, it's not fair to say Klopp was stopping this happening, but he was such a big personality. He had to make so many decisions, because that's just how management has always been. That this was never going to come in to that extent with him in charge.
Yeah.
So the opportunity to reset how the club worked and bring a manager in who fit into that perfectly was what they saw as sort of the main appeal.
And this is in an industry now where football, the modern history of football, especially in the last 20 years, is trying to get finer and finer and finer margins. But there is still actually a lot of waste in the sense of exactly these issues, or kind of managers taking, I suppose, decisions that will always be based on kind of the next game because of what they understandably feel at the time. I think we're going to enter into the next step of that. I think Liverpool will become very historically significant champions in that sense, in kind of in showcasing this. But yeah, like even on the Areola point, like the way it was put to me was, here's someone who's just like, it's devoid of ego in the right way, who kind of very, very ambitious and confident in what they do, and Slot is exactly the same, but also with the lack of almost that kind of pride, almost to be willing to always discuss what they do and what works for the players. And like even to say with Areola, the way it's felt like we've suddenly seen a return, say, to him letting players take people on, which has been an element of it with Liverpool as well.
Well, I will say one of the main tactical things I observed in the video was that there is so much more freedom given to Liverpool's players on the ball than there is to Man City's players or to Arsenal's players, or to a number of teams even below that. The amount of times they seem to be making their own decisions and are trusted to sort of, like, especially in the build-up or in the final third, it's not necessarily so structured and so set. Like, I love watching Arsenal because you can just see exactly what they worked on, and it works more often than not. But there's something more fun about watching Liverpool at the minute, because you don't know when someone's going to go wandering into a completely random zone once per game and never go back there. Which I think is really, really good.
But I also think that's so central to Salah as well, because I mean, obviously, like this year we've seen his numbers skyrocket, not just in goals but in assists, where he's become this kind of. He'd become that kind of complete modern forward to now a complete modern forward and a playmaker. Yeah. And one of the things actually for me most stood out about Liverpool's season was just the distinctive angles of so many Mohamed Salah passes, which we hadn't necessarily associated in the same way.
Well, again, not to be too self-referential, but I put this in the video. I think he trusts his teammates in this system a lot more. I felt like he was trying to do it all on his own last season. He scored more. He scored more goals this season from less shots. He's having, even though Liverpool are much better than they were last season, he has less attempts at goal because he trusts his teammates visibly so much more to do the right thing with it, because he knows around. And if you look, again, not to dig out one player, after we've just praised Liverpool profusely for 30 minutes to now end on just digging somebody out slightly, you've gone from having, I know Gakpo plays on the left, but it does move into that central area more than, say, Diaz does. You've now gone from pretty much at the top end of the pitch, having the worst underperformer in terms of chance conversion in Darwin Núñez, to now one of the Premier League's best overperformers in terms of chance conversion in Cody Gakpo. And I think that's another testament to what Slot's done.
And I think they do, from speaking to people within Liverpool as well, there is this feeling that he's not quite there yet, but Gakpo can become like, he can do what Mane did, and suddenly kind of just, there'll be one season that comes where suddenly he shoots up and starts scoring a lot more.
He's already got. I mean, what did he get? 17 this season or something? Which
Yeah.
Gone very under the. I think it's obviously very easy to praise. Salah, to praise Van Dijk. I mean, again, just I'm going slightly spiraling ever so slightly here. You know the thing about the most minutes played.
Yeah.
If you only have to go down fractionally to about 12th or 13th place, and there's Ryan Gravenberch, someone else they've really prioritised. Having fit. I think that's all there is to say about why Liverpool are so good. I could get into the fact that I think it's really funny they're allowed to sleep at home before home games now. Slot argues that they get better sleep on their own mattress than they would in the club hotel, so they changed that straight away. I think that's funny. Yeah, because I didn't realise footballers all slept in a team hotel, like some kind of year 11s on a school trip.
Well, that's always the classic Italian idea, the ritiro. You bring them away. And I think it just moves towards. It brings them towards this era of like the making sure every element is looked after.
I think we should do that for this podcast. So the evening before, anytime we record, they should stick us in the Radisson Blue over the corner for the evening. I think that would make sense. Right, well, thank you very much for joining us for State of Play. Please let us know what you made of all of this in the various comment boxes and reply forums. Miguel, where can they get you on the internet if they want to do that?
They can get me on Twitter, just my name, Miguel Delaney, or sorry, X, as I should say.
X, there we go.
Blue Sky, Instagram as well, all the usual.
You can get me everywhere at Adam Clery, CLAROI. But don't do that. Go and get me on ACFC on YouTube, which is the Independent's brand new tactical channel with me, where I did a 25-minute long breakdown of how they did all of this season. But this was better because you were here and you know more than me about things.
That's...
Right, and on that note, thank you very much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.